Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Social Innovation Think Tank, where we'll discuss the latest ideas and thinking on social innovation. My name is Paul Tracey and I'm Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the Cambridge Church Business School and Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. And we have here as well my colleague and co-host, Neil Stott, who is also Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation and who leads the Masters in Social Innovation that we run. And I'm very pleased to welcome today's guest, who is Martin Parker. Martin is Professor of Organisation Studies in the School of Management at the University of Bristol, where he leads the Bristol Inclusive Economy Initiative. And Martin is a critical management researcher, and a lot of his work is about challenging conventional thinking about business and about markets and about organisations. For example, he recently edited a collection of papers on how anarchist ideas can inform contemporary management. And we invited him today to talk about a book that was published a couple of years ago, back in 2018, which is called Shut Down the Business School, What's Wrong with Management Education, in which he suggests that business schools have essentially become, I guess, kind of corrupted, a kind of malevolent force that's contributing to the big social challenges that we have in the world rather than helping to solve them. And that critique was very interesting to us, having set up a Centre for Social Innovation inside a business school. And it's a topic and a question that comes up a lot from our students, from our entrepreneurs, and the stakeholders that we support. So, Martin, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Pleasure.
Let me start off by asking you, what have you got against business schools? Can you give us the essence of your critique?
Yeah, I suppose, the quick headline version of this would be that business schools reproduce some of the worst excesses of capitalist structures. So in a sense, my critique is that they are, as you just nicely summarized, they're contributing to the problems that they're claiming to be addressing. And I think that the problems in most business schools in most parts of the world are so severe that effectively we need to think about not just reform or adding a CSR module, but really radical changes in the way that they imagine themselves, their students, the knowledge they produce, and so on.
But I guess a kind of an alternative critique is that business schools are in fact incredibly successful university departments. 20% of people who are studying in the UK are studying business and management. There's obviously a demand that's being met by these schools. So, what do you say that they're clearly successful given that so many people want to participate in them?
Yeah, that's a pretty awful argument, isn't it, really? An awful lot of people want to be emitting carbon and eating McDonald's and driving cars, but that doesn't mean that we can simply assume that that's the right choice. I think there's a whole series of problems that business schools are complicit in and have been for quite a long time. Let me just roll back a little bit, because I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that this is the case for all employees and all students in all business schools across the entire world. My critique is rather aimed at the 95%, if you like, because I do think there are examples of really interesting stuff going on. It sounds like the kinds of things that you and Neil are involved in would certainly fall into that category. But there are something in excess of 13,000 business schools in the world, and the vast majority of them really uncritically reproduce a set of knowledges about the inevitability of managerial hierarchies, about assumptions about growth, whether in terms of number of products or customers or companies. Growth is effectively seen as the metric of success. And also a kind of really a set of assumptions about the necessity of particular kinds of corporate and capitalist structures. So I think those three assumptions are really embedded in the curriculum of most business schools most of the time. And as a result, it becomes quite difficult for people to surface and think about alternative ways of imagining organization, economy, markets, and so on. Now, it sounds like you're trying to do that at Cambridge, and that's fantastic, really admirable work. But I think that the kind of stuff that you're doing should be the mainstream, not part of the not part of the specialist offerings, if you like.
So do you really think we should shut these things down, or is there perhaps a less radical alternative that it might involve some kind of reform where business school looks a bit different?
Yeah, you're going to chase me on this, aren't you? So, I mean, the book is partly a rhetorical thing. Okay, so shut down the business school. You know, the whole point of it is it's a sexy title that's intended to sell a provocative argument. Nonetheless, when I've been talking to a whole variety of people about the ideas in that book, I think that the necessity of root and branch change is really important to maintain. I remember the year the book came out in 2018, I was doing some kind of thing for the Chartered Association of Business Schools with a bunch of business school deans. And you know, their response was, well, a kind of bemusement as to why I would be biting the hand that feeds me with such enthusiasm. But also this kind of pushback, but you know, we do teach about, you know, environmental sustainability, and we've got a corporate social responsibility module and all the rest of it. You know, it's like, yeah, no, we do these things. It's fine. And that, you know, that's just decoration as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think, you know, at the moment where the nature of the crises that face us, whether we're talking about democracy or carbon or inclusion or anything else, means that every single module we teach has to be predicated around alternative ways of thinking about business. You know, it should not be possible to teach a module in a business school without making reference to low carbon production. You know, but never mind whether you're teaching finance or marketing or accounting, any of this stuff, it all has to be in there. And I think the idea that somehow business schools can get off the hook, I have done for years and years on a whole series of topics, whether it's ethnicity or gender or whatever, by kind of having a specialist module on it, is just not enough. It really isn't enough. And so that's why I end up, you know, kind of pushing at the bulldozing metaphors, because I want people to try and understand the gravity of the change that's required, and not let deans off the hook by, you know, claiming that they've signed up to the principles of responsible management education, so they're okay.
That's great.
So one thing in your book that really appealed to me, Martin, was the idea of schools of organising. That's, you know, business schools should be something more, and that appeals to me because, you know, increasingly our work is not just about business or even social enterprise. It's about public service. It's about civic society, grassroots organising in different forms of organising, or the, you know. So can you tell us a bit more about what you actually meant by a school of organising and what the implications might be?
Yeah. Again, I need to step back slightly and explain the context for them about some of this stuff. My background isn't in business and management, it's in sociology and anthropology. And I kind of came very late to a business school. In some senses, you know, I've always kind of felt like a bit of an outsider. But I think partly because of that, I've always had a strong sense that anthropologists, historians, sociologists, and so on have been describing forms of organization for, well, for a century or more at least. So, you know, my kind of core discipline is sociology. The sociology of organizations, very well established for a century now, and lots of the key sociologists, which people would, you know, basically dead white men with beards who've kind of formed the sociological canon, are centrally concerned with forms of organization. So for me, organization is a wide category, which we can, you know, define very loosely as, you know, how human beings and things come together to do stuff. And there's lots of different ways in which they do those things. But then I, you know, end up working in schools of business and management, and the concept organization seems to get restricted. Yeah, it's almost as if you're only ever talking about profit-making formal organizations, usually with corporate structures. And if you look at, you know, the vast majority of textbooks and so on, then effectively they treat the corporation as if that were the ideal type model of organization. Yeah, as if all other forms of organization aspired to be the corporation, and the corporation was the most efficient, effective way of generating innovation, of generating profits, of employing people, whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. And that seems to me an extraordinarily narrow version of what it means to organize. So as you just alluded to, Neil, you know, that it seems to me that we can add to a gigantic list of organizational structures and cultures and policies and practices, almost ad infinitum, by looking at sociology and history and anthropology, and that we can learn from all that kind of stuff. So the proposal for a school for organizing is really a kind of, and I suppose this is partly in, you know, a sort of an addendum to the response to Paul really, is an attempt to kind of refound what the business school has become, and to say that the proper object of inquiry of a discipline that is concerned with organisation and exchange should be much more ambitious in its subject matter than it is at present. And the sort of metaphor I use, which seems to work reasonably well, is, you know, what would we think of a history department that only ever taught about the 15th and 17th centuries, or a biology school that was only interested in arms and legs and crustaceans or something, yeah? And I think effectively that's what the business school does. It just teaches about one form of organisation and then tends to ignore co-ops and mutuals and the voluntary sector and tribal forms of organisation amongst the newer and the mafia and hierarchies of angels and all the other ways in which we can think about that concept. Now, that's a betrayal of the idea of the university, which I think is supposed to be an inclusive thing, not just a finishing school for capitalism. But it's also a kind of, I think, a dangerous thing in terms of narrowing imagination. So, you know, given, again, the crises that we face, surely we should be trying to understand the huge variety of ways in which we can organise and confront some of the problems that we need to deal with. And that means we need a very experimental, a very diverse, a very varied conception of organisation. Because, you know, there is no one best way. There isn't one form that's going to save us. Sorry, I went on a bit then, Neil. But
no, I mean, one dilemma that we struggle with is obviously social entrepreneurship is very legitimate at the moment. You know, one could argue it is a part of the neoliberal project, and people are pushed into a model, you know, charity people, etc., because it's only a game in town. And one thing that we try and talk about our students is there are many other ways of organising and other games one can play. So that's why, you know, your ideas really appeal to us about organising. You also wrote, or you edited a book called Life After COVID-19 recently.
Yeah.
And in it, I think you talk about opportunity and threat. I mean, could you just tell us a bit about your introduction in that book, which I thought was very powerful?
Yeah, I mean, it was a strange book, and I'm still not quite sure how I feel about one. So back in sort of early lockdown in the UK, which was sort of mid-March, I think quite a lot of us were feeling both kind of terrified about the changes that were happening around us, but also for myself, quite intrigued about how quiet the city was and how clean the air smelt, and that I seemed to be able to hear the birds, and there weren't jets going overhead all the time, and I was spending more time cooking and talking to my partner, and, you know, all sorts of good stuff was going on amidst the horror and the pain for many people. Now, it's all very well, you know, somebody like me with a house and a garden and a reasonable salary, and I can work online as we are now, saying those kinds of things. But in a sense, I guess the sort of changes that I'm enthusiastic about seeing almost generalize early COVID, yeah, in terms of the reduction of carbon, different ways of thinking about transportation and work, and a whole series of systemic changes. So the book came out of that sort of sense of optimism and the beginning of all those memes about no going back and build back better and all the rest of it. The sense that COVID provided a pause, a reset, an opportunity for us to think in more ambitious ways about re-engineering the systems that we're part of. It reminded me in that sense of the financial crisis a decade previously, because I remember at that time as well, a lot of people, including myself, talking about the idea that this crisis was an opportunity to rethink finance, you know, to reimagine the way that the flows of capital move around the planet and the kinds of things that they encourage and discourage. That was a real missed opportunity. Obviously, pretty much we went back to banking as usual, which is, you know, a source of considerable regret, I think, and has contributed to our problems too. This time, I think that the momentum is greater, that there are now so many people, so many institutions, including many of the big corporates and national banks and all the rest of it, talking about the idea of the economy needing to be re-engineered, to be changed, to be repurposed in various ways. But COVID could mark something of a tipping point in the way that we conceive of our economy. And it does seem to me that the book is a kind of an echo of that in a way. You know, it's a sort of a reflection of a moment where there was a crack in the world that let the light in or something, you know, in which it looked like it might be possible to change things. Now, there are also lots and lots of voices who are talking about bouncing back, obviously, aren't they? And that kind of rhetoric of bouncing back seems to me to be really quite dangerous in a variety of ways, quite understandable, because many people, whether they're politicians or ordinary citizens, do want to go back to the kinds of comforts that they had, to the ways in which they were living their lives and thinking about transport and all the rest of it. At least those people in the kind of the more affluent countries in the world and the more affluent parts of those countries. But I think it's really vital that we don't lose that sense of there being other ways of doing things. After all, I mean, you know, just to very briefly cover the argument there, I mean, you know, in a period of 2 months or so, effectively, pretty much everything about the way that the way that Britain operated changed in terms of transport and many assumptions about who could work at home and how they could work. And you know, the University of Bristol, just like Cambridge, I'm sure, effectively was then suddenly, you know, all its buildings were empty and it was suddenly distributed across kitchen tables across the southwest of England. You know, that was an astonishing achievement, and undoubtedly had some considerable effect in terms of transportation and all the rest of it. So lots of things changed, and suddenly we found out that there was a magic money tree. Who'd have guessed it? You know, and that we could spend cash on a bunch of stuff. So, you know, that bodes quite well for Green New Deal stuff as well, I think, if we can ensure that the money is spent on some good things too. But yeah, the idea of crisis and opportunity is now a well-worn trope, but certainly one wanted to exploit when I was trying to do that book about COVID.
I mean, I'd like to believe you, but I mean, you alluded to yourself that, you know, post 2008, people were saying things must change, and things did not. The rubber band was stretched to a point and then pinged right back. And we got austerity, which one could argue has led to part of the mess we're in now, because of capacity of hospitals and care and community services, etc., were cut right back. As a practitioner, I witnessed it, you know, for many years. That's what worries me about, you know, this sort of situation is, you know, the hope will go back to business as normal, and it could be worse because the money tree, you know, may not be there forever, and someone will say, oops, we have a huge debt, therefore we're going to cut everything.
Yeah. So 2 questions. One is state debts can be punted a long way into the future. Yeah, we don't need to treat them like household debts. You know, this is macroeconomics on a different kind of scale. So I think if we want to find some more cash, we can find some more cash. You know, we paid off the war loans a couple of years ago. You know, the Second World War loans. That's probably going to be okay. What I think's more important, though, is the kind of relentless optimism that's required in order to think about change. Because, yeah, I mean, you know, on many occasions, Neil, I fear about our future and my optimism falters. But in a sense, these are kind of political choices too, aren't they? And I think unless we imagine that there are different ways of organizing the future, and unless we commit to, in our own institutions, our own lives and our own activism of trying to bring out the change we'd like to see, then nothing will happen. You know, it's almost like that. I kind of increasingly feel that pessimistic evaluations of change also are performative, in the sense that they sap the energy that's required in order to make the different world that we need. And I'm not particularly accusing you of that or anything, because very often they're highly realistic understandings of the systemic reasons we can't change stuff. But, you know, when you've got, say for example, we talk about the financial system, which is absolutely crucial in terms of the ways that, you know, capital gets moved around the world and the kind of things it gets invested in and all the rest of it. You've now got really senior figures at, you know, big global institutions talking about the possibility of stranded assets and carbon. Yeah. And that becomes a big signal for a whole bunch of very large investment companies and pension funds and all the rest of it. I mean, BlackRock the other day, for example, to start pulling funds out of carbon because they'd be dumb not to. Yeah. And there's no particular idealism in that, but BlackRock understands, just like everybody else, that if it wants to have a future as a company, then we need to have a future as a planet. So it needs to be pulling out of carbon, whether it likes it or not. So some of this stuff will kind of, I think, will be accelerated by citizen enthusiasm for these kinds of things. Other parts of it are really kind of enlightened self-interest on the part of capitalists and corporations who just want to make sure that they've still got a future to be making profits from.
This brings me nicely to the next question, which, I mean, a lot of our work at the centre is rooted in place, and you know, my particular interests are around community organisations who are struggling to make places more sustainable and more opportunity. And you've created the Bristol Project. Could you tell us about that, and well, why, and what do you do? Yeah. Okay. So I moved to Bristol about 2.5 years ago, and I was given the opportunity to repurpose an existing research unit into the Inclusive Economy Initiative. And the sort of stuff we're trying to do is probably quite parallel to yours in a variety of ways, but essentially there's kind of three elements to it. One is working with a whole series of low carbon businesses and business networks in the city. Bristol's has a long and, you know, quite impressive tradition of organizations that are involved in various kinds of low carbon business. So the Soil Association's based here, part of the Environment Agency, Triodos Bank, really interesting, Green Bank, the Sustrans, the Alternative Transport Organization, Centre for Alternative Energy, whole, you know, series of organizations. So it's a political constituency in the city that matters. There's also, because Bristol was a green capital in 2015, there's a legacy organization called the Green Capital Partnership that now has over 1,000 members, all again committed to low carbon forms of business. So we're working with a whole bunch of those people in order to push forward those kinds of issues, different ways of thinking about business practice and so on. On the other hand, there's also in Bristol a really important political tension between the, you know, often quite middle class enthusiasm for green politics and highly divided city. So Bristol, you know, is two cities. There's a relatively white, relatively affluent, well-educated north and west, and a much more diverse and much poorer south and east. So in order to understand the dynamics, both in terms of politics and economics within the city, you also have to talk about questions of social justice and inclusion. Yeah, it's simply not possible to do that. Whilst, you know, the really reasonably well-fed inhabitants of Clifton are busily eating their sourdough bread and supping their lattes, at the same time, people on the other side of the city are living in bad accommodation, with bad wages and extremely limited access to good food and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So the other part of the inclusive economy stuff is to talk about questions of inclusion, about, you know, who's in and who's out, because green/red politics in cities like Bristol are quite complicated. And in a sense, the policy trick we need to pull off is to ensure that there's no particular contradiction between a politics of inclusion and a politics of zero carbon. And that's really vital. That's what, you know, most smart policymakers understand, is that we need to ensure that not only that the kind of political acceptability of the kind of changes that we require in order to reach zero carbon is assured, but also that the kind of policies that we push forward are ones that don't hurt the poorest. Yeah. So in that sense, then we're also trying to do work with a variety of other groups that are, if you like, primarily concerned with the two cities problem. Now, the interesting thing about that for me is both the kind of the power of the potential of engaging a big university like Bristol in a whole variety of different networks across the city, but also some of the dangers of doing that kind of stuff, because I don't think it's as simple as the university, you know, me, professor, blah, blah, you know, and then running into a room and saying, it's okay, the university's here, where we'll help.
because there's a bunch of very smart people who've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, whether they're working in co-ops or mutuals or banking, whatever it is. They understand what they're doing. So it's not obvious what the university does, and that needs to be continually negotiated in some quite complicated ways. So I think sometimes for certain groups, it's really helpful to have the university badge, because it helps them bid for grants or to get evaluation funding, whatever it might be. But at the same time, the university is very often seen as quite a suspicious institution in the city. It's powerful, it's white, it's up on the hill. It's not it's not always the 7th Cavalry. It's just, it could be the 7th Cavalry. Maybe that is the right metaphor. It's a problem, in lots of ways. So I think that the continually thinking about exactly how the university engages with the city then becomes quite a practical form of politics in itself, which requires us as academics to be very thoughtful about our own positionality and what we can bring to the room. Yeah.
Cool.
I'm assuming, Martin, it's an interdisciplinary initiative, so it's.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should have said. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's at the moment we haven't got much money or anything, but it's a university research institute. So I'm bought out for some of my time. We have to bid for research grants, do all that kind of stuff. At the moment, I've got about 35 academics within the initiative, and most of them are in social sciences, but not exclusively. But to me, it's really important that it's not seen to be something which is solely about that comes from business and management, if you like. Because I think that though business management is relevant to many of these problems, it's certainly not the be all and end all. And I want to make sure that people from sociology and politics and history and engineering and the rest of it, who also have enormously useful and interesting things to say about this, get engaged too. In a sense, part of the problem, I think, is the word economy. And I've noticed the effect that has on lots of other social scientists, almost as if as soon as you say that word, and also, when you say that you work in a school of management or business, they kind of assume that they're not going to be interested in you. Yeah, that you're some kind of glib, shiny neoliberal, and why would I want to talk to you? Because I'm a sexy sociologist. It's like, why would I do that? So part of what I've also had to do is a kind of a process of I guess thinking about my positionality within the institution as well, and trying to gain a degree of credibility as someone who, I might be based in the School of Management, but I'm not of it, and I'm interested in much broader questions than that. I have to do that in order to establish a certain legitimacy, I think, with a wide variety of other constituencies.
Because obviously the discourse of interdisciplinarity, working across, that's been around for some time, but the practice of doing it is always been challenging for lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
One of the potential ways of collaboration that's really exciting is in the classroom. Maybe sort of coming back to the start of our discussion, maybe one of the ways in which we can start thinking about new ideas around organising and what society should look like is to involve more of our colleagues from sociology or anthropology. I know at Cambridge on the MBA programme, one of the most popular electives for many years has been a course on the philosophy of management, for example.
Oh wow!
2 people in the philosophy department.
Okay.
And so when you start to, I think the classroom actually is a really great way in which we could potentially involve colleagues in other departments.
Yeah, I do agree. And one of the things, I think you're much more advanced on this than I am. But one of the things that we are starting to move towards now is thinking about courses, whether certificated or not, in terms of spaces in which we can get people together. One of the difficulties, of course, as you just alluded to, is that because I'm formally a kind of university level research institute, and I don't want it to sit within management and be defined solely as management. That means that it's very difficult to find ways of actually getting any certificated course stuff going, because the quality assurance processes and the money and all the rest of it in universities basically moves up and down, and it's really hard to get most universities to construct something a bit different that's located in different spaces. And I think that's been long been my experience of attempts to do interdisciplinarity, that, you know, the fact that the cash goes up and down means that the ideas can't go sideways, which is a bizarre reflection, but true nonetheless.
And how does the local politicians, you know, do you gel with their agendas? Do they support what you're doing as a centre?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to over-egg this. I mean, you know, we are, that the university is connected into the city council in a whole variety of different sorts of ways. And I'm not the only person who's doing this kind of work. What I've been particularly interested in is trying to gain some understanding and hopefully a bit of influence over the ways that the city council is thinking about both inclusion stuff and carbon stuff. Bristol City Council has a particularly interesting series of kind of quite experimental structures at the moment, in that it's set up something called the City Office, which is supposed to be a kind of hands-on policy office, which is now running something called the One City Plan, which is an attempt to bring together a whole series of partners from across the city. And the One City Plan is being operationalized through 6 city boards, one of which is an economy board. So this is a kind of recognition that in times of austerity, that the City Council simply can't solve the kind of problems that the city faces. And there is, I think, not everybody is going to agree with me on this, but I think there's a palpable sense that there's the beginnings of a much wider conversation between key institutions across the city as to their collective responsibilities. And to be part of that, I think, for the university is absolutely crucial, to be engaged in those kinds of things, because both for the University of Bristol and also the University of West of England, which is the other big university in the city, they have a lot of influence and a lot of potential, and they must be engaged in these kind of conversations. But I think we're seeing different modes of kind of city governance, both formal and informal, emerging now, which might produce some really interesting effects, although it's a little too early to say.
I think it's very important. I mean, you know, you're a critical management scholar, but you're also engaged in the everyday stuff, you know, hands-on stuff. I think that's quite important. If we're going to make the changes we talk about in class, we have to experience the trials and tribulations of this sort of work ourselves.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, to be clear, I mean, this is new territory for me. You know, I've spent the last 30 years just, you know, being a regular member of departments, and, you know, really deep, you know, big research director and head of department and those kind of things, and dealing with precisely the kind of questions, the vertical questions that that beset us in universities. The moving to Bristol allowed me to almost kind of rethink what it meant to be an academic, and I'm still puzzled about that. I'm still puzzled about what it means to be doing this kind of work. My partner just says I'm a kind of fat man in a jacket who cycles around the city having cups of tea with people, and, you know, in a sense that is what I'm doing now. You know, I'm just spending an awful lot of time having cups of tea in cafes, and I don't know whether it's working, whether what I'm trying to do makes any sense, but it really does feel like I'm kind of in my late middle age reinventing myself and what I thought my commitments and my expertise were, and trying to be a sort of connector or ringmaster or something for a whole series of different potential initiatives. And I don't know whether I really don't know whether it's working. You know, I don't have a clear sense of this, but it's interesting. I am enjoying it.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, I mean, I guess one question, and I'm conscious of time a little bit, Marn, is
Sure.
thinking about your COVID book, going back to your COVID book. If you were to ask your the authors who contributed to the book in 5 years' time to do a follow-up chapter, are you optimistic that they're going to be writing about this as a pivotal moment of change for the world, business, or do you think it's going to be back to business as usual and this chapter will be about missed opportunities and what could have happened?
Yeah, I guess I refer you to my earlier answer, sir, which is, you know, that there's a kind of performative in any way in which I might answer that question. And I kind of feel at the moment that I want to sideline any pessimism or realism and just focus on possibility. And I think that's partly because the sort of tidal wave of horror that faces us, if we don't have that kind of attitude, is too much to bear. And so, you know, to maintain some sense of sort of efficacy, of being able to do something or feel I'm doing something about the future, you know, for my kids and for all of us, is so important. I'm just kind of bracketing all the possibilities that it might not work. And that's kind of, you know, bizarre in a sense, because obviously as an academic, you know, you're supposed to be providing realistic, balanced appraisals of things, and trying to sort of calculate what's going to what the problems with any particular situation, what the kind of power dynamics in the situation might be. But at the moment, I'm kind of waking up every morning and saying, you know, what can I do? What can I throw myself at next? Like a crazy dog at a patio door. So the answer to the question is yes. In 5 years' time, they will write about this as a pivotal moment. Yeah. Yes. Because I don't want to believe anything else.
I think that's a very optimistic note on which to.
Yeah.
So, no, I just want to say thank you very much indeed.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me, Paul. Thanks, Neil.
Really, really interesting, and we learned a lot. And as you know, as we said at the start, you know, what you're doing has a lot of relevance for the ideas that we're trying to work with in the Centre for Social Innovation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.